In this video, we're going to talk all about color theory. I am going to walk you through analogous color palettes, contrasting, and also within this color theory lesson, we are also going to give you, I am not multiple people, I am also going to give you a lesson on how to lighten your colors with water versus adding white paint. Make sure you stay till the end. I'm going to be giving you a little link to a free download, which is my entire Intro to Floral Watercolor booklet. This thing is packed with color theory lessons, basics for watercolor lessons, and floral watercolor step-by-step lessons. So let's get started. So I am going to open my trusty Sidekick booklet to the page about color theory, the color wheel page. And we're just gonna chat a little bit about color theory as I work my way through the colors of the rainbow. So what I'm gonna do here, instead of painting a color wheel, because that's gonna be in the guide for you, and I'm also gonna have a different video tutorial on how to paint a color wheel, separately, I'm going to be painting line swatches just so we can go over how to lighten your color with water gradually. So this technique is really going to help you if you're painting realistically, or if you want just a lighter version of a color that's in your palette already, you just swash it around in your water cup and get it lighter. So we're going to be doing value scales for each color of the rainbow: Roy G. Biv, red, orange, yellow, blue, G. Biv. Brain fart for a second. Roy G. Biv. Red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. And that's going to teach you how to gradually lighten your colors. Whenever I say the word value, what I mean by the word value is the lightness and darkness of a color. So let's do this. I'm going to be using my size 6 brush, round brush that I have linked below. So if you don't have these brushes and you want to check them out, check out the links below. I'm only going to be using my size 6 brush this entire exercise. It's just an exercise of swashing your brush up and down to create a swatch on your page and then gradually lightening it with water. So to get started, I am going to start with my color in my palette called Scarlet Lake, which is also linked below. All these colors, paint colors, palette, paper, etc., they're all linked below in the supplies section in the description. So I'm loading up with a really thick amount of Scarlet Lake on my brush, and what you want the consistency to be is kind of like a heavy cream consistency. We don't want it too thin to be the lightest value or a lighter value of our Scarlet Lake. I want it to be a really opaque and dark value of Scarlet Lake, so I'm grabbing a lot of it, but I'm also making sure that I'm touching my brush in the water just a little bit the more I dig around, so it doesn't completely dry my brush out. So I have good amount of water, but even more amount of paint on my brush. All right, so once I get a really thick amount of Scarlet Lake on my brush, you can kind of see on the hair or the belly of my brush, it's pretty decently coated with Scarlet Lake. So I'm gonna go to my paper and lay down a swatch of Scarlet Lake. And all I'm going to be doing from here is just like a 25 to 35 degree angle away from the paper, go up and down a couple of times with my brush to make a swatch. And then from here, I'm going to gradually lighten the color that's on the belly of my brush with water by swashing it in my water cup gradually. So I'm just going to go in my water cup and flick it around, and then release that excess water by swiping it on the edge of my jar, and then pulling this color down. So we're just making a big long red stripe, and every time I go about 2 inches down, I'm swashing my brush in the water cup to get rid of more pigment. So as you can see, it's getting gradually lighter and lighter as I pull the stripe down. I'm not worrying about clean edges or anything like that. I'm just going from dark to light value, and then smashing my brush at the end to release pretty much all the pigment and just pulling it down. Okay, so now I'm going to move on to red orange. because we're going to be going through an analogous color palette. So an analogous color palette is basically when the transition between hues or colors is very gradual. So I'm going to be going from red to red orange, and all I'm going to do is grab a lot of Scarlet Lake on my brush again, or a decent amount of Scarlet Lake on my brush again, and then rolling it on top of my orange. You could also do this with your yellow, but I'm just going to go for the orange I have in my palette. And I'm going to put these pretty close together so that if they do touch, it's fine, because we'll just have a nice little, a fun little explosion of wet and wet color. So I'm doing the same thing, going about 2 inches down and then releasing pigment in my water so that it gradually gets lighter and lighter. And there we go. Now I'm going to keep moving on. What I have on top of my orange color, because I rolled around on top of it with my red, I'm just going to grab that so it has a little tinge of red in it, and then grab a little bit more orange underneath and do the same steps. Now we're going to grab my orange just by itself. Again, not worried about touching. This could be a really fun pattern for like textiles or background for your screensaver. Once we're all finished, it's going to look nice and pretty. And one thing I want to mention too is I have 2 separate cups of water. I mentioned this in my other videos, but the reason for that is so that I separate warm colors from cool colors. And these are all warm colors so far in my palette. So I'm doing like all my reds, oranges, and yellows here. And then once I start to transition over to like greens and blues, I'm going to use my other cup of water so it doesn't turn brown. So now I've got my orange color on my brush, and I'm just going to make it a yellow orange because we're going from red to red orange to yellow orange to yellow. So I'm going to grab orange and then roll it on top of my yellow so that it's a bit more of a yellow orange. And if you're worried about contaminating or dirtying a color with another color on top of it in your palette, that's just my style. I'm very type B. I really don't care if my palette looks messy, as you can tell. But if that bothers you, then just bring it over into a separate well and you can mix it separately there. But it's super easy to clean up color when it's on top of another color. You just add water to it and soak it up with a paper towel. All right, so now I'm just gonna go for an even brighter yellow orange by grabbing what was on top of my yellow and a bit more yellow underneath. Just a gradual transition. This analogous color palette is super easy on your eyes. So whether you're painting a floral piece or a landscape, animal, whatever it might be, whenever you have analogous colors, so colors that sit right next to each other on the color wheel or transition very gradually, it's super easy on the viewer's eyes and it makes them look at your piece for longer. So it's an easy transition from color to color, making it more peaceful to look at. Whereas if you have like contrasting colors, for example, you're gonna have a lot of strain and a lot of competition going on, which when used appropriately can be very effective in pulling people's eyes in and drawing attention to something. So I've got all the way to this bright yellow, which I'm just gonna add a bit more yellow up here. While it's still wet, we can add more color to make it a smooth, diffused transition. If it's dry, it would create hard lines. So now I'm gonna start working my way into the cool colors. So we've gone from red to red-orange to yellow-orange and then to yellow. Yellow is that in-between primary color. We'll have red and then blue on either end, which red, blue, and yellow are the primary colors, with red and blue being bookends to this analogous color palette. So we're gonna gradually start working our way into yellow-green, into green, blue-green, and then blue. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna grab my yellow and then just roll on top of my sap green here with my yellow, just a little bit, so it's a small transition. Okay, now we're doing the same thing, starting darker with a darker value and gradually pulling that down with water. So releasing the pigment in our water cup. I'm going to my cool water cup for this because it's a cool color. And about every 2 to 3 inches, swashing around for more water. This is getting really, really light really quickly, so since it's still wet, I'm just gonna grab some more color and punch it back in for it to diffuse. Now we're getting more green, so grabbing that yellow green that's on top and grabbing more green underneath it. I'm just kind of eyeballing it in my palette. If it's looking like a harsh transition of color from my last line of color, then I'm gonna add more yellow to make it more yellow and softer transition. But just kind of being loose about it. It's not math or science. We're not trying to get equal parts this or that or a certain amount of ratios. It's just kind of going by feel and by look. So now I'm grabbing pretty much just green. That was a fun bleed. Since those two lines next to each other were really wet, that did a little fun bleed. Fun wet and wet. Our next line is going to be blue-green. So I'm just grabbing sap green and then I'm gonna roll on top of my Prussian blue. And now I'm grabbing what was on top of my blue, which had a little bit of green on it and a little more underneath for an even deeper blue-green. This is Prussian blue with a tad bit of green in it, but Prussian blue is probably my all-time favorite color. It's super deep and rich and lovely. So if you're new to watercolor, doing these value scales where you're going from a really thick amount of paint to a really light amount of paint, or lesser amount of paint with more water, this is a good lesson for you to just see how much depth you have with just one color. You don't need to be buying a red and a lighter red, or a darker orange and a lighter orange to stock up your palette, because you really have that full range within just one color. So now I'm grabbing just blue on my brush, a really thick amount of this Prussian blue because it's a thick color and I want it to be really opaque, so I'm grabbing a lot of it to show you just how dark it can go. Okay, we're running out of room a little bit, but I'm just gonna go for it and add a blue purple, or a blue violet here next to the blue. We're not gonna go fully into violet and then red violet because we don't have space, but if you wanted to, you could if you have room. I'm gonna mix my Prussian blue on top of my Opera Rose for just a little bit of Opera Rose. Opera Rose is this pink color. It's like a bright neon pink. Again, if you're a type A person, this shot of me putting blue on top of pink is probably really stressing you out. But again, if I want to pick this up, I just add water to it and dab it up with a paper towel. It comes right off. So I've got enough to where I like the color that I'm seeing on here. It's a really pretty pinky blue color, or pinky purple color, and I'm gonna go back to my paper and do the same steps. So when you're mixing up colors, like the purple, for example, or whatever, try using not super traditional colors, like red and blue, for example, would have made a completely different purple than this pink and blue. That's just my little tip for you. Obviously, if you want a more traditional violet or purple, then you can do the red and blue with it. But I just like mixing it up and showing different colors that I can access or tap into with my palette. Okay, so now that we have this really fun like background rainbow situation, let's talk about color relationships for a second. I'm gonna go into a lot more detail on color theory in future lessons, but just as an overarching, something that you should always be thinking about when you're painting and using color, if you're not referencing a photo or you're just kind of coming up with a color palette for something, is thinking about creating harmony versus creating strain or disharmony. So for example, as we worked through this piece, we were talking about analogous color palettes and how the transition on your eyes is super smooth and super peaceful. What is the message, or what are you trying to convey with the piece that you're creating? So is it something that you want to seem more peaceful and more easy on the eyes, or do you want to create kind of like a punch and something that gets after people's eyes and pulls them in, something that has contrast? So if you are wanting to use something a bit more like bouncy or something that draws people's eyes in and creates a statement, you're gonna wanna use more contrasting colors. So you're gonna wanna reference the color wheel in my floral watercolor booklet that I have as a download, so make sure you check that out and download that. On page 9, there's a full color wheel, and if you look, basically anything that's directly across from another color is going to be its contrast or complementary color. So I mentioned about how you want to make sure you're using contrasting or complementary colors effectively, because there are ways that you can make that relationship look really straining, and I'll talk about that in a future video. But for the most part, contrasting colors, you don't want to overdo it, and you want to make sure that one of the colors, so red and green for example, you want to make sure that one is more dominant than the other, so you have more areas that are red than green, or vice versa, or a lighter red, a darker green, etc. So we'll get into more contrasting colors in a future lesson, in a future video, but for now, just kind of play around with analogous color palettes, something that's a really easy and gradual transition. So from like red to red-orange to orange to yellow-orange, etc. They're neighbors on the color wheel. They love hugging each other. They love being right next to each other because they're related. They have something in common, like red and red-orange have red in common. So it's really simple, it's really straightforward, and it's something that is a small tweak that you can just be applying to your floral pieces, to your landscape pieces, etc. that will make all the difference in someone who's viewing your pieces. So I hope you enjoyed this lesson. Check out the free download, make sure you print this out and look at all the instructions I have in here for you, and we will see you in a future video.